So I'm going to talk about different ways in which we have studied the perception of degraded speech in the laboratory, entirely in adult participants, but with a view to trying to inform some of the issues that you're concerned with. Now, if our goal is to improve speech perception, there are three very simple ways that we can do that. The first, the simplest, is simply to make the signal clearer. So to give you a kind of visual analog, if we increase the clarity of the written word or decrease the level of the noise, we obviously improve the perceptual outcome. And I'll take you through some studies in which we've done that using fMRI initially. The other way in which you can support perception, though, is to provide other cues, other forms of knowledge that will support perception. Obviously, in developing children, you might do that through lip reading or other such cues. But perhaps what we all hope can happen in the face of a degraded or challenged hearing system is that you can adapt or encourage the perceptual system to adapt to this degraded signal in such a way that improves perceptual outcomes. And I'll come on to that third sort of manipulation towards the end of my presentation. So I'm going to start here, starting from experiments that my colleague Ingrid Jonsrud and I have been doing for over a decade now, looking at what changes in the brain's response to speech as the signal becomes clearer. Now, to do this, we've been using a vocoded speech stimulus, which is proposed by Bob Shannon in the mid-90s as a way of simulating what someone with a cochlear implant might hear of a speech signal. Just to show you how we make that. So start over here with a spectrogram of a speech signal. We divide it into frequency bands or channels at approximately logarithmic spacing. We extract the amplitude profile in each of those bands and use that to modulate a band of noise or pulse trains or other signals, which we then recombine into a noisier or more degraded version of the original spectrogram. What does that sound like? Well, I can play you an example now. Let me play that once more. So if you don't understand that, you're in good company. It's very challenging for listeners to understand these vocoded stimuli, at least initially. But what we can do with this stimulus is to vary certain parameters, whether that's parameters that relate to how many bands, how many filters we use, how the amplitude profile is extracted, the way in which we superimpose the signals onto carriers in order to manipulate the intelligibility of the resulting signal. And that's something that Ingrid Jonsrud and I did in a paper now published over a decade ago. So for this form of noise vocoded speech that I've played you, we made example sentences, a large set of example sentences for which we can change the report score, change the intelligibility of the stimulus. So for the most difficult condition, we would expect listeners to report maybe a quarter of the words in a typical sentence correctly. We make stimuli that are more intelligible, adding more bands to the vocoder, or adding even more bands to get up to relatively high levels of word report. Now we do that not just for vocoded speech, but for two other forms of manipulation, which I won't go into detail on now. But suffice to say, we've changed two different parameters of the speech signal. We've changed the amount that you can report, and we've changed the sounds of the speech signal in these three different ways. Now, if we look in the neural response, in the temporal lobe in particular, what we see are characteristic patterns indicative of two profiles. So within regions that are close to primary auditory cortex, we see a response to intelligibility that depends on the acoustic form of the speech that's presented. As we go further forward or further back in the temporal lobe, we see these ventral and dorsal pathways. So the areas in blue respond to the intelligibility of the speech signal, but they're insensitive to the way in which the speech has been manipulated. And these are candidates for brain regions that are contributing to higher linguistic processes. Now, one response that I'm going to focus on in this study, and it's going to guide all of the studies that I'll present subsequently, is this response in inferior frontal regions. Now that's depicted here. So on the y-axis we have the bold response that we measure with fMRI. On the x-axis we have the amount of words that participants could report from typical sentences. And what we see in inferior frontal regions and also in precentral gyrus in motor regions is this inverted U-shape. So responses are maximal for speech that's degraded and somewhat intelligible. This isn't unique to this study. It's been shown in many other studies since. I'm going to show you two example results. We've seen it in more or less all challenging listening situations. We see this recruitment of inferior frontal regions. Apologies, the brain seems to have shifted, but hopefully you can make out. So the blue curve in the inferior frontal gyrus shows again that inverted U-shape function, this time for a variation in signal-to-noise ratio. So the maximum response for signals that are somewhat intelligible, but nonetheless degraded. Interestingly, you see a continuing increase in response if the sentences are made anomalous in some way. Another study showing this inverted U-shape, this time showing an interaction with attention. So in situations where we present speech of varying intelligibility and cross it with a manipulation of attention, so changing what participants are doing whilst they're in the scanner, we see this inverted U-shape again, but it's only in the situation where they're told to attend to the speech actively. If we give them distracting tasks, we no longer see that inverted U-shape. So this is indicating processes that we think are associated with effort at understanding. So those processes that you and I go through in everyday situations where we're facing noise, background sounds, unfamiliar speakers with unusual accents, etc., but that for hearing impaired children, this is their day-to-day experience. Now, one thing that we can do in laboratory studies, and we think also helps in the real world, is to provide some form of helpful knowledge, some sort of prior knowledge about what the content of the speech signal will be. Now, we do that obviously with lip reading, but we also do that for television programs with subtitles, for instance. The way in which that's most often been studied in laboratory situations is to set up sentences like these where the prior context for the sentence sets up an expectation for the word or words that will follow. And so we might expect that identification of the word in this degraded box would be better in the case where it's the expected relative to the unexpected or incongruent word. Now in laboratory studies, we've actually used a version of this manipulation, but a more extreme one where we provide subtitles rather than semantic or sentential context. And what we've been interested in is trying to understand the neural interactions or the mechanisms by which that form of prior knowledge, which comes from higher linguistic representations, can influence lower level sensory processes. Now, one form of inspiration for this is views of predictive coding, widely proposed in sensory systems across a range of different modalities, a range of different animals. I'm going to simplify this greatly to suit my insights as a sort of simple-minded psychologist into a very simple equation, which is that the goal of sensory processing of speech is to process what you hear, to compare it to the sounds that you'd predicted in advance, and to compute a quantity called prediction error that we use to guide higher level processing. So in this very simplified view, the fundamental computation is one that takes the sensory input and subtracts what you knew in advance, what you knew before you'd heard that sensory input. The computation of prediction error is something that's happening within regions of the superior temporal gyrus that are critical for speech perception. And we can measure prediction error using a variety of different neuroimaging techniques, neural responses with MEG and with fMRI. Both seem to show hallmarks of this prediction error signal. And probably the clearest illustration, though, comes from showing you and playing you the same vocoded sentence that you heard before. Now, if I tell you the sentence that you're going to hear, it should sound strikingly clearer when you know what's being said. So this is a phenomenon called perceptual pop-out, which we have studied in a variety of different ways. Now, one study that I'm going to take you through in some detail came from a PhD student's work. So this is Ed Sahoglu's work, published in the Journal of Neuroscience a few years ago now. So Ed used the same vocoding manipulation that I've shown you before, this time with single words. What he did was to precede those degraded words with a written stimulus that provides information on the content of the speech signal. So if you hear clay after the written word clay, you get this benefit to your perceptual outcome due to prior knowledge, and we compare that to situations in which you either have mismatching prior knowledge or a neutral string, a row of X's that gives you no information about what's going to follow. Now, Ed gave listeners the task of reporting their experience of the degraded signal. How clear or degraded did they experience it as being? And in order to make that a sensible task, he also manipulated the sensory details, so the number of channels in the vocoder, so that the speech was either very degraded or rather clearer. Now, as you might expect, if you make the speech physically clearer, they rate it as sounding clearer, but listeners also do the same thing when they're given that matching text. So actually giving a written clue as to what you're about to hear is equivalent to doubling the number of channels in the vocoder. So it gives you that subjective experience that the speech is clearer than you would otherwise hear it. What does that do in terms of the neural response? Well, we measure that with MEG. In fact, we're using combined MEG and EEG, the advantage being that this gives us very good source localization by combining these different measures of electrical and magnetic brain activity. Now, starting with the manipulation that comes from the previous fMRI studies, this is contrasting responses to speech that is relatively detailed, 8 channels, 8 bands in the vocoder, greater than 2 channels. What we see are responses in the superior temporal gyrus here on the left that mirror the responses that we saw in the fMRI studies that I showed you earlier. So as the speech becomes physically clearer, so the response of the STG increases. Now, in contrast, if we make the speech sound clearer with written text, what we get is a very different pattern. So the response starts early. So here in the first 100 milliseconds after the onset of the spoken word, we see this frontal response that distinguishes the match from the mismatch or neutral trials. And that's followed relatively late on by a response in the superior temporal gyrus. But in this case, it's a reduction in the response. So the response is smaller for speech stimuli that follow matching text. Now, this is actually an indication that 2 opposite changes are happening in the brain response in the superior temporal gyrus. And I'm going to show that to you more directly here. So if you increase the amount of sensory detail in the speech signal, you get an increased response in the superior temporal gyrus. If you make the speech sound quieter with matching text, you produce a decrease in the response in the same brain area. Now, this is indicative of that subtraction that I showed you here. So if you increase the amount of sensory detail, you'll increase the prediction error, increase the amount of neural activity. If you provide prior knowledge that informs about the content of the speech signal, you're changing the other half of the sum. You're going to reduce the amount of activity in the superior temporal gyrus. And so these opposite effects of 2 manipulations that have the same subjective outcome is a hallmark of predictive coding. Now, I don't have time to take you through some follow-up studies that we've been doing with multivariate fMRI analysis, but again, it's the same outcome. As the speech becomes clearer physically, so you get more information coded in the superior temporal gyrus, if you provide matching prior knowledge, then you get a reduction in the amount of information signaled in the superior temporal gyrus. So, enhances speech perception, it suppresses MEG responses in the STG, and modulates fMRI pattern information, and it's consistent with these predictive coding computations. Now, this is very useful and powerful knowledge for our laboratory studies, but in practice, the listening situations that people with hearing impairment face don't always provide opportunities to make the signal clearer or to obtain written subtitles. What we might want to do is to hope or provide opportunity for the perceptual system to adapt to the signal. And that's something that we've done in the lab through studies of perceptual learning. This happens in the real world through the forms of auditory rehabilitation, which I'm sure you are all more familiar with than I am. You know, those experiences in the first few months, certainly for adult cochlear implant users, where what was formerly unintelligible noise becomes relatively intelligible speech. What can predictive coding tell us about rehabilitation or perceptual learning processes? Well, one thing that we might want to consider is whether, in terms of our equation, whether perceptual learning is enhancing the sensory input, so increasing the signal extraction in this bottom-up path, or whether it's changing the prior knowledge that you bring to a perceptual situation, the way in which you extract information when you know a bit more about what you're expecting to hear. And so that's something that, again, we're able to study in the laboratory using vocoded speech. So the first clues to this comes from some studies that published a decade ago, where we just played people these vocoded sentences of the sort that you've heard, one after the other. Now what we found is that if you score people's accuracy at reporting the very first sentence of vocoded speech that they hear, they're pretty poor at it. So they're reporting less than 10% of the words in a single sentence correctly. As you give them repeated exposure to vocoded sentences, they get better and better. So by the end of a 20 or 30-minute exposure period, they may be getting over half of the words in a typical sentence correct. Now that shows a very powerful form of perceptual learning, in this case in healthy adult listeners, of a sort that we can explore in the laboratory to try and discover the cognitive and neural processes that are at work. Now, I don't have time to take you through the detailed experiments that we've done on that, but I'm just going to illustrate one study that comes from Alexei Hervé-Adelman's PhD work, which is to illustrate how the experience that I gave you of pop-out, so the experience of hearing a degraded word when you know what's being said, enhances perception. So this is a study where listeners hear single words, they report what they hear, and they then get these feedback presentations where they hear the word clear and then degrade it again, giving them that pop-out. We compare performance with listeners who get exactly the same number of presentations and the same task, but the order of the clear and degraded presentations is changed so that they never get that experience of pop-out. Now what you can see, we repeat this for 120 words, we score them on their report accuracy. What you can see is that for listeners who get their pop-out presentations, we see improvements over time in the amount and accuracy of their word reports. And these are absent for listeners who get exactly the same number of presentations, but without that pop-out presentation, without that experience of knowing the identity of the degraded sounds before they hear them. So just to summarize the work that we've done on perceptual learning then, we've shown in that study and in others that if you provide prior knowledge of speech content, that seems to enhance or support the perceptual learning process. Perceptual learning enhances the perception not only of the words that you've been trained on, but also of new words and even variants of the vocoder with different carrier signals or different frequency bands. So perceptual learning is not a form of rote learning. You're not learning about individual words. You're learning something general about the way the speech has been transformed. In fMRI, we've seen that perceptual learning is associated with enhanced activity in frontal and motor regions. And these frontal responses and the perceptual learning are both suppressed by distraction. So we think it's the frontal responses that really accompany perceptual learning. And what I'm going to show you in the last study today is we think that what's going on is that these frontal areas are making predictions for the sounds that will be processed by the superior temporal gyrus, and that's what seems to be driving learning, at least in these laboratory situations. So the study again comes from Ed Sohoglu. It's very recently accepted for publication. So what Ed did was to take some listeners, expose them to vocoded words at different levels of clarity, and ask them to repeat the words that they heard. We do that before and after a period of training. And what you see is that for the most degraded stimuli or for the clearest stimuli, there's no change in report. But at an intermediate level of clarity, this 6-channel condition, you see a very large, reliable change in word report accuracy. shows approximately 10% changes in word report accuracy overall, but there's substantial variation between individuals, and we're going to use that in the analyses that I'll present later. Now, what is it that constitutes the training period? Well, it's the same manipulation that comes from the earlier MEG study, so the experience of hearing degraded words when they follow written text that matches the word that you're going to hear. For comparison purposes, Ed also included some trials with a mismatching word, and again used this task of getting participants to report or rate how clear the speech sounds. Now, this data substantially replicates the earlier MEG study, both in the behavioural outcome and in the neural outcomes. So we get this opposition in the superior temporal gyrus, so an increased response for speech with more sensory detail, a decreased response for speech that sounds clearer because it follows matching written text. Again, the hallmark of this predictive coding equation. Now, when we come to compare the neural responses before and after training, if we look at speech that's physically clearer, we get the same increased response in the superior temporal gyrus. We see the same thing in motor cortex. That's probably because they're more successful at reporting those words aloud. What we see in left and right STG is an interaction, though, between the amount of sensory detail in the signal and whether the neural responses are measured before or after learning. So let me show you that. So here in the 6-channel case and in the 12-channel case, we see a reduction in the neural response subsequent to the training manipulation. Now, with further source localizations, we've been able to show that exactly the same regions in the STG show all 3 of these manipulations. And furthermore, that both the magnitude of the prior knowledge effect during the training period and the changes due to perceptual learning are correlated on a participant-by-participant basis with the amount of learning that they show. So if you show a larger reduction in the brain response due to matching prior knowledge or subsequent to perceptual learning, that's associated with a bigger enhancement in perceptual outcome. And so what that seems to suggest to us is that prediction error is not just a feed-forward signal that's used in perception. The goal of minimizing prediction error is what drives perceptual learning. So what listeners are doing is using their frontal predictions to guide subsequent predictions in order to minimize prediction error and to enhance subsequent learning. And so we've covered 3 ways in which you might improve speech perception in our laboratory studies and shown that to some extent they all seem to reflect this hallmark of predictive coding, the idea that you're comparing what you hear to what you expect. And that's where I'll finish and thank the colleagues who contributed to all of this work.